This week, we're going to learn about divergent and transform boundaries. Our essential question, what you should be able to answer at the end of this lesson, is what land or crust features form at divergent and transform boundaries. First, a quick review of last week. We learned about convergent boundaries. To converge means to collide or combine, to come together. We looked at when two continental plates converge, they push up and can make mountains like the Himalayas. The plate that India is on is converging or colliding with the plate that Asia is on, and those push up to make the Himalaya mountains, such as Mount Everest, one of the tallest in the world. When two oceanic plates converge, the ocean crust is much thinner, so one of them will get subducted or pulled under the other one. At a subduction zone, you always get two landforms. You get a trench and a volcano. The trench is that deep part that happens right here. You can see almost that V from the subduction or going under. And then anytime a plate's subducted, some of that melted material will push back up through that thin crust or through the crust. Since this is in the middle of the ocean, it's going to make an island. It's a volcanic island. So the Aleutian or the Alaskan Islands are a great example of this. You can also have ocean crust converge with continental crust. That oceanic crust is more dense than the continental crust, so again, it gets subducted underneath. Again, anytime you have subduction, you get a trench, that deep area, and you also get a volcano. Some of that melted ocean crust that was subducted underneath can push back up and almost burn a hole through that continental crust to make a volcanic mountain range. So those volcanic mountains, or the Andes Mountains in South America, are a result of the Pacific Ocean plate being subducted underneath the South American plate. We'll start this week with divergent boundaries. To diverge means to divide or separate. When tectonic plates or pieces of the Earth's crust separate, this is a divergent boundary. And there's two types of divergent boundaries. You can have oceanic crust separate from oceanic crust, or you can have continental crust separate from continental crust. We'll first look at an ocean-ocean divergent boundary. We've looked at this already. This is seafloor spreading. If you remember, the crust or outermost layer of the Earth is broken up into tectonic plates. Underneath the crust or tectonic plates in the mantle, you have these convection currents, heating and rising and cooling and sinking. This seafloor spreading is pushing the ocean floor apart. Because the ocean crust is so much thinner than continental crust, it averages only 3 miles thick compared to continental crust, which can be about 40 miles thick. Because it's so thin, when the plates separate, the stuff underneath the plates, that mantle, which is basically magma or like hot lava, can punch up through and reach the Earth's surface. When it hits that cold ocean water, it solidifies, it turns into rock, or in this case, mountain chains. When you have these ocean-ocean divergent boundaries, you have two landforms or two land features. You get a mid-ocean ridge, that chain of volcanoes in the middle of the ocean, but because this process keeps going, because those plates keep diverging, the mid-ocean ridge splits a little bit in the middle, and you get what's called a rift valley, this kind of gap in the middle of that mid-ocean ridge. A great example of an ocean-ocean divergent boundary is the island of Iceland. Iceland is right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's actually in the middle of the mid-Atlantic Ocean Ridge, or the mid-ocean ridge. That mid-ocean ridge has volcanoes constantly pushing up, and it's built up high enough to actually come above the surface of the water and make the island of Iceland. Iceland is right on the North American plate and the Eurasian plate. The North American plate is moving to the west, and the Eurasian plate is moving to the east, and the mantle underneath those plates can bubble up and form these mountain chains, these volcanic mountains. You also have those mid-ocean ridges split to make a rift. Here, this picture is taken underwater near Iceland, and you can actually see the two different tectonic plates where they've diverged, and they make what's called this rift valley here. You also get a divergent boundary when two continental plates move apart from each other. Continental crust, remember, is much thicker than oceanic crust, so when those two continents separate, they actually never separate enough for that magma or lava underneath the crust to come out. The pieces of continental crust separate and pull apart from each other, but they don't expose any magma. They just have the piece of crust kind of drop down, and that makes what's called a rift valley. There's a great example of a rift valley in Africa. So we have a continent-continent divergent boundary, and it's actually called the Great Rift Valley. If you look at our world map here in this area that's circled, Africa is actually on two different tectonic plates. You have this kind of brown African plate, which most of the continent Africa is on, but the upper northeast corner is this yellow area, the Arabian plate. Those two plates are diverging or separating from each other. And if we look in the bottom left, you can see the African plate is moving kind of to the southwest, and the Arabian plate is moving to the northeast. That divergent boundary is separating the continent of Africa. Makes a really big rift valley. Again, you can see one tectonic plate moving in this picture to the left, and then opposite that, a tectonic plate moving to the right. Scientists predict that in about 10 million years, Africa will completely separate. This little Arabian plate will completely break off of Africa. A transform boundary happens when two tectonic plates slide past one another. They're not moving toward one another. They're not moving away from one another. They're just sliding back and forth, as you can see in this model here. So one plate in this case is kind of moving up, and the other plate is kind of moving down. This doesn't make any really exciting landforms or features. What happens though is energy can build up in this area, and that potential energy can build up and build up. And then if the Earth moves suddenly and releases it as kinetic or moving energy, you get an earthquake. The most famous example of a transform boundary is the San Andreas fault line in California. You can actually see part of that fault line in some areas in California. And if you look at the model pictured here, you can see that the North American plate is moving southward, and then a little bit of California and down South Mexico is on the Pacific plate, which is moving up. So over time, the part of the North America that's on the Pacific plate is going to move up more and more and more. This is one reason why there's so many earthquakes in California. They're right on a boundary, and it's literally grinding back and forth against one another as those plates are moving. To be clear, all three types of plate boundaries cause earthquakes. We have earthquakes at convergent or colliding boundaries. We have earthquakes at divergent or separating boundaries. And we also get earthquakes at transform boundaries. An earthquake is just when the earth quakes or moves, when that potential energy builds up from those plates shifting and moving, and then suddenly releases in the form of kinetic energy. And those happen along faults or fractures or breaks, or we've called them boundaries in our Earth's crust. Next week, we'll look at those in more depth.